So Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron, what they want to do, create a Palestinian state. If you had elections, they've said it's got to be a democratic, sovereign Palestinian state. If there were elections today or next year or whatever, Hamas would win the elections. So do we want to hand a Palestinian state over to Hamas?
Colonel Richard Kemp, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Stephen.
I want to ask about Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer's decision to recognise Palestine as a state. Is this the right thing to do?
Well, the first thing to say is that Palestine as a state does not exist. So recognising it is actually doing nothing, and it will change nothing in terms of the potential creation of a Palestinian state or anything like that. And I think we need to understand why that both of these leaders and other world leaders have decided to do this. For example, the Prime Minister of Canada, who's got the same plan in mind, even if he hasn't yet announced it. And that's in order to appease their members of their electorates and their political supporters who are anti-Israel, which in the case of Starmer and the Labour Party is a very significant number because, of course, we still have Corbyn's Labour Party. It hasn't changed. It's maybe had a coat of paint put on it, but nothing much about it's changed. So it's still, not every member, obviously, but a large number of them are vehemently anti-Israel. And so, with Starmer's big difficulties, political difficulties in the UK at present, this is a step that he needs to take, in his view, in order to rally some support, given the pressure he's under. But what's it going to do on the ground? As I said, nothing. It's not going to advance the cause of a two-state solution, even if that was possible now, which unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, is not possible after the 7th of October. There was a two-state solution tried in Gaza from 2005 onwards, when Israel completely withdrew from Gaza. And the end result was the 7th of October 2023. Now, Israelis, you like or dislike Israelis, they're not stupid people. They're not going to allow anything like that to happen again, which is exactly what would happen if the Palestinians were allowed to create their own state in Judea and Samaria, otherwise known as the West Bank, and in Gaza. Exactly the same ideology exists, may be expressed in slightly different ways in the West Bank as it does in Gaza. And there's no way Israel can allow this to develop again. So it has to maintain its military forces in both of those territories for the foreseeable future. If it doesn't, then Israel again is going to suffer very, very severely.
But as you mentioned, the West Bank exists, Gaza exists, millions of people there who call themselves Palestinians, who see themselves as Palestinians exist. So recognising those people as having a kind of self-determination or sovereignty over their own land, isn't that the fair thing to do, the just thing to do, to give them statehood? They've
got autonomy. The Palestinian Authority, which was established under the Oslo Accords, gives autonomy to the Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza. Not statehood, but autonomy, self-governance to a very significant extent, self-determination to a very large extent, but not full statehood. Now, how can you? My question would be, how can you have a full statehood, sovereignty, if you've got a foreign army inside that state, which is what Israel would have to do? Israel cannot leave either of those two states, because if it did, you'd have 7th of October times 10, times 100 even, all over again in due course. So it may be the right thing to do, but it's not the sensible thing to do from Israel's own defensive perspective. And let's not forget another thing, the Palestinians, certainly the leadership of the Palestinians, and polling shows a very large percentage, probably the majority of Palestinians, do not want a two-state solution. They want the annihilation of Israel. That's what they're set on. And so they've been offered their own state numerous times, including pretty much the whole of the West Bank, the whole of Gaza, East Jerusalem, and a tunnel connecting Gaza and the West Bank, which was offered in 2008 by the Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Olmert. It was rejected. That's the best they could possibly hope for, but it was rejected, which tells you something. And nothing's changed much. If anything's got worse since 2008. It tells you that the Palestinian leadership and many of their people do not want their own state. They want one state solution, which is no Israel.
Is there not an argument to say that if you did give Palestinians a state, then these attacks would stop against Israel, that the Palestinians, they just want to be left alone, they just want their own country, they feel that they're being oppressed by Israel, they feel that Israel is attacking them, you know, tens of thousands of people have obviously been killed in Gaza during this war, so they're incredibly angry about that. But if you give them a state, then, you know, some of these attacks would stop, you'd still have extremists, but they would at least have their own sovereignty.
Yeah, that's an argument that people might make or might have made until the 7th of October, because that's exactly what happened with Gaza. It was given complete autonomy. There was no Israeli presence inside Gaza. And what did they do? They, instead of turning it into what could have been the kind of, I don't know, the south of France on the Mediterranean. I know the south of France is on the Mediterranean, but, you know, on that bit of the Levant. They could have had that. Instead of that, they turned it into an engine of war to attack Israel with. And I don't think you can suppose that that wouldn't happen again. You may hope it wouldn't, but hope is not a strategy that you can use if you're talking about defending your country. So I don't think it plays. And if you look at Mahmoud Abbas, him and the Palestinian Authority have just been sanctioned by the United States State Department for supporting terrorism and for encouraging terrorism and radicalization against Israel. Now, that's the situation now. Why is that going to change if you grant them a supposed state? It's not. All that's going to happen is that they will have greater opportunity to carry out much more terrorism against the Jews. We shouldn't forget this is a religious war. It's not a war about land, which is why I said before, they don't particularly want their own state. They're not interested in the land. What they're interested in doing is following the letter of Islamic doctrine, which is that if any territory once was ruled by Muslims, which the current land of Israel was most recently under the Turks, it can never be ruled by anybody else ever again. So they have a religious duty to wipe out Israel.
It's an interesting point you make there. So Palestine used to be, obviously was a state, you know, before Israel existed. And, you know, again, the argument goes that these people have a right to the land that they've lived in for a long time, and they have a right to their own statehood, therefore, because they live there. They just want to live in this land that they've always lived, that their parents have lived, that their grandparents have lived, and so on. And they would say, look, we deserve a state. We used to have a state until Israel came along, and now we don't. And we feel that, you know, it's only just and fair that our statehood is restored. Yeah,
but Palestine was never a state. What was known as Palestine for a period of time was, for a long time, it was a province of the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't an autonomous sovereign territory at all. It was just a part of the Ottoman Empire. And then it became the British mandate for Palestine after the First World War, when the Ottoman Empire was defeated essentially by the British Empire. And a decision was taken to turn that into the national homeland for the Jews. And if you were talking about indigenous people, it's the Jews that are indigenous to the land of Palestine. Their history there goes back significantly further than anybody else that's living today. And the other point to be aware of, I think, that people don't really understand is that the majority of the Arabs who are now living in that territory came there after the Jews began to develop the land. The land was barren, it was swamp land, it was malaria infested, there was little, if any, agriculture until the Jews arrived. And when the Jews arrived and started developing the agriculture and then developing industry, then Arabs from all around the region, including Egypt, Syria and other places, and Saudi Arabia, came in to get fat off the back of the Jews, which worked quite well until essentially really starting in the 1920s, 1930s. The forerunners of the Muslim Brotherhood there, led by the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, decided to turn against the Jews, and that war has been running on pretty much ever since then.
Do you think there can ever be a time where Palestine can be recognised or should be recognised as a state, the so-called two-state solution that you mentioned? I know you say that October 7th essentially rules that out, but does October 7th eventually expire in a way? You know, in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, the people who are responsible for that will be dead. And, you know, you can't hold people to the sins of their, you know, ancestors or their fathers or grandfathers and so on.
No, you're right, and I don't think it's about holding them to the sins of their fathers and grandfathers. I think it's really all about Israel's assessment of the threat that would present. Now, there's no real reason to suppose that that threat's going to dissipate. Not that I can see. I can't see any way it can, given the religious nature of this war. Although there is one, I think there's one, maybe one optimistic note on that, because I think probably before the 7th of October, certainly, many Jews, I don't know whether it was most Jews, but a lot of Jews living in Israel they supported a two-state solution. They wanted the Palestinians to have their own state. And that did change sharply on the 7th of October. I think you'll find very few who do now. Now, you're right to say that that's something that isn't going to go on in perpetuity. But it would take a change of I suppose, of mentality among the Palestinian people. And what that needs is de-radicalization. If you speak to, I mean, I've been into the West Bank, I've been into Gaza, I've spoken to many Palestinians there, including very recently. You'd very rarely meet any who have got anything apart from hatred for Israel. And okay, you could say, well, look at what Israel did since the 7th of October in Gaza, but it predates all of that. The kids in the West Bank and Gaza have been indoctrinated, using our taxpayer money, by the way, to fund anti-Jew and anti-Israel school books and films and all the rest of it, been indoctrinated to hate Jews. So that's, you know, that process, it's not going to happen overnight. It's a long-term process. But I think the one piece of optimism I would have is if the Abraham Accords are extended and endure for a number of years, then already when the UAE and the other countries that joined the Abraham Accords did so, this led to questions among some Palestinians. So there were, you know, ordinary Palestinian people were saying, well, if our brothers in the UAE can work with and, you know, cooperate with the Jewish dogs, then why can't we? And it's small murmurings, perhaps. But if it was extended, let's say, to include Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries, which I think is quite likely to happen, then in the longer term, maybe there could be hope there that they would see that example and see that they were actually isolated in their loathing of Israel and the Jews. I don't know if that's likely to happen. I think it's possible.
Do you have empathy for those children or those people in Palestine I should say in Gaza and the West Bank, but particularly in Gaza, who, let's say they've had relatives killed by the IDF, who weren't in Hamas, you know, who were collateral damage? I mean, this has been a pretty brutal war. Can you understand why they would hold so much hatred for Israel?
Of course. I mean, you know, if you look at the way they've been indoctrinated to hate Israel before this war, and then they look around them and see the absolute destruction and mayhem and death and blood and fire that they think has been caused by Israel, but actually has been caused by Hamas. You know, even though Israel's been doing a great deal of destruction, none of this would have happened if Hamas hadn't invaded Israel. But of course, you know, it's obviously their hatred and their anger is going to be amplified. But there's one other thing to be aware of. I was in Gaza about 2-3 weeks ago. I spoke to a lot of people in Gaza, including quite a lot of kids. I must have spoken to about 100 people in all. And one of the things they were saying, I mean, they didn't really say we hate Israel and the Jews, because I think that's just taken for granted. But they were saying, I hate Hamas. I hate Hamas. Kill Hamas. We want Hamas out. And when people said that, there were crowds of people around when they said it. There was cheering from those who could hear. So And I certainly got the impression, talking certainly to some of the adults, that they blame Hamas for what happened. They blame obviously Israel, they blame the Jews for what happened, of course, but they also blame Hamas for what Hamas did, which brought it upon them. So, you know, I think I'm not saying that in order to make you think that suddenly Hamas is going to be ousted, because they're not. The only way Hamas is going to be ousted is on the end of Israeli rifles. But there is certainly a strong anti-Hamas feeling in Gaza, much more actually than there is in the West Bank. Hamas is the most popular political entity in the West Bank today. So Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron, what they want to do, create a Palestinian state. If you had elections, they've said it's got to be a democratic, sovereign Palestinian state. If there were elections today or next year or whatever, Hamas would win the elections. So do we want to hand a Palestinian state over to Hamas?
So you say that the only way to destroy Hamas is on the end of Israeli rifles. And I know that you have had lots of experience in counter-terrorism throughout your career. You talk about people being radicalized and so on. Is it not the case, but by continuing the war in such a brutal way, you are creating new members of Hamas? Is this not what we see with terrorism throughout the world? By responding to terrorism in such a harsh and unrelenting way, you are just creating more radical people, more terrorists to deal with. And, you know, how can you ever deal with Hamas when it's just can sort of regenerate like that?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. You know, probably you could say Israel's the best recruiting sergeant for Hamas. And it's probably true for reasons we discussed just a short while ago. But what's the alternative? Is the alternative to say, okay, well, we'll create more and more Hamas by doing this, so we'll just get the hell out of Gaza and let them carry on as they were before, and then we'll have another 7th of October, which they've promised, their leaders have promised time and time again. So you have to deal with it, and Hamas has to be eliminated. And the elimination, I said on the end of an Israeli rifle, but it could also be by them being exiled, which I think is certainly a potential plan, to exile at least the Hamas leadership out of Gaza and let them go somewhere else in the Middle East, whether it's Algeria or somewhere that's willing to take them. That's a possibility, and that could have a significant effect on the overall organization. But you're absolutely right as well when you kind of suggested that, okay, you can get rid of Hamas. You know, you can not kill every single one of them, but get the leadership out, kill the leadership or whatever, kill a lot more of the terrorists than already been killed. But then something else is going to rise up in its place, and maybe Hamas too, or maybe something pretty different. It's going to rise up. So for that reason, Israel has to stay there and keep its heel on it. And I don't mean that in a kind of this is not a vindictive thing. This is in the interests of Israeli self-preservation. It's like in the West Bank. There have been big problems in the West Bank. There may be bigger problems in the West Bank, but they're pretty much contained compared to Gaza because of the Israeli military presence there, in many cases cooperating with the security forces of the Palestinian Authority. But without that presence there, we'd see the whole place developing into another Gaza. And your sort of, not analogy, your suggestion that you know, killing them just creates more, which is probably true. You could apply that also to the Second World War. If we hadn't invaded Normandy in 1944 and then gone on to bomb the hell out of, and before 1944, the bombing campaigns, etc., fine, that would have created more Nazis. People didn't like that. Hamburg didn't like being firebombed. Bremen and the other places that got bombed didn't like that at all, and they would have gained greater hatred for the Allies. And probably the Nazi Party got, I don't know whether it got more membership or not, possible. But it was the only way to end the war. You know, I kind of compare what Starmer and Macron have said to Netanyahu: end the war, and we will recognise a Palestinian state. It's like Roosevelt saying, end the war with the Nazis in 1940, or we will recognize the Greater German Reich. It's the same, it's obviously completely different scenarios, but similar kind of thing.
It's an interesting comparison with the Second World War. I think, from what I understand, when Churchill and Roosevelt said that we will only accept unconditional surrender, that actually did drive a lot more Germans to be hardcore Nazis and to fight until the end of the war, which could have led to more Allied deaths. But so whether that decision was right is one that historians debate. And talking about Hamburg, I mean, the firebombing of Hamburg, I think Operation Gomorrah, may have killed 45,000 people, most of whom were kids, old people, women. Most of the men in the city were out fighting or in factories or different places. So again, I'm not saying I necessarily agree with this, but I think there's a strong argument to say that the Allied carpet bombing campaigns, if you're looking back on it now, sort of 80 years later, weren't necessarily the most moral decision. I mean, killing tens of thousands of civilians for what really wasn't too much military gain, probably that may not have been right. I mean, what's your view on that?
And other people say that it made a major contribution to the defeat of the Germans. And you could argue the same about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yeah. You could say it was a bestial action to drop nuclear bombs on cities which had huge civilian populations. But the alternative, in the eyes of the people making the decisions at the time, okay, in retrospect we might think something differently, but you've only got to look at the people who were making the decisions at the time. In their eyes, if they hadn't bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, then the Japanese would have kept on fighting, necessitating an invasion of the Japanese home island, which would have cost, by their estimates, 1 million American servicemen killed. And not only that, but many more million Japanese soldiers and civilians killed. So for, I don't know, I can't remember how many were killed at Hiroshima. It was 100.
About 100,000, yeah.
100 and something thousand. Was that worth it to save the lives of, maybe a number of millions of Americans and Japanese? These are tough decisions that have to be taken, unfortunately.
Presumably when you were in Afghanistan, though, you weren't saying, right, let's carpet bomb these cities and kill thousands of civilians. I mean, the moral code of war has changed dramatically since the Second World War. Would you accept that?
Yeah, but if you were kind of making that allusion to suggest that Israel's carpet bombing Gaza, it's not. Israel. I mean, I read the other day someone that suggested that I don't know if it's true because I haven't checked it, but something like 8 times as much volume of explosive have been dropped on Gaza as the explosive power of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. But if you look at if you look at the relative figures, I think we said something like 100 to plus, at least 100,000 killed at Hiroshima, probably many, many more. Whatever the number was, it represented about 40% of the total population of Hiroshima that were killed by that atomic bomb. And if you look at the Hamas numbers that they give for the population that have been killed in Gaza, it's something like 2.5%, something like that, of the total population, according to their figures. I don't know if they're right or wrong. I assume they're exaggerated, but I don't know that. So that doesn't show, if that's 8 times the amount that killed 40% of the population in Hiroshima, what that shows is not that the Israelis are carpet bombing, it shows that they're carrying out very careful precision bombings against terrorist leaders. And when you have terrorist leaders and terrorists and weaponry and the other paraphernalia of a terrorist organization that is embedded in a civilian population, closely embedded in the civilian, inside and underneath the civilian population, then there is no choice other than to kill, tragic though it is, and much as the Israelis try and avoid it, to kill innocent civilians. It's, if anyone can find me or suggest to me a way of killing Hamas without killing civilians, then that would be great, and I'm sure the Israelis would be grateful to have it passed on, but I haven't heard anyone say that. So that, it's a tragic reality, but if you compare the statistics, and it's terrible to reduce human life to to kind of ratios and statistics, but you spoke about Afghanistan. By American estimates, in Afghanistan, 5 civilians were killed for every combatant that was killed by Allied forces, not by the Afghan forces, by American and British and other Allied forces in Afghanistan. And if you look at, certainly by my calculations, I could be wrong, but I'm not going to be very far off, I think. The Israeli ratio is 1 civilian to every 1 combatant. It may be 1.5, I don't know, it's hard to know exactly, obviously. But it's something like that, working, by the way, on Hamas figures. So that shows, to my mind, that shows the opposite of carpet bombing. I know all these things are terrible, but as I said, find a way of, and the other thing not to forget, compare it to Afghanistan or Iraq. This conflict can't really be compared to any other conflict. I don't think there's anything else that's comparable particularly. But in one sense, you know, there is a comparison to be made. The Taliban, Al-Qaeda, the other jihadists in Iraq and Afghanistan, they used human shields. They used mosques, they used schools, they used hospitals for carrying out terrorist attacks. But they did not do it in a way that deliberately sought the deaths of their own civilian population. It happened. Of course it happened, 5 to 1, as I mentioned, in Afghanistan. But Hamas, their entire strategy is built on getting the IDF to kill as many of their civilian population as they possibly can. For a simple it's the only army, if you call Hamas an army, in the history of conflict that I know of, where an army has sought the death of its own civilians. And that's in order, of course, to get the world to turn against Israel. And it's the same with the what I consider to be hugely exaggerated cases of hunger and starvation and famine even in Gaza, which I don't think is anything close to the truth. But that's the current narrative that's going on. And the extent to which there is hunger is brought about not by Israel, but by Hamas. They want Israel to be seen to have starved their civilian population. They're quite happy for Gazans to go hungry if that will be brought about.